Welcome to EPG Pathshala. This is a part of the course on American literature, and this particular module is History of American Literature 1700 to 1800. My name is Niladri Chatterjee. I am professor at the Department of English, University of Kalyani in West Bengal. What I wish to talk about in this particular module is the way in which American literature developed, and more importantly, the way in which American literature took shape. So what we will be doing in this module is looking at basically the evolution of American literature. At what point does it become recognizably American literature? And we are going to look at the way in which American literature also began to define itself with respect to literature from other countries, and especially literature from the United Kingdom. I think the first thing that we have to keep in mind is that perhaps no other person is more important at the inception of the way in which we understand American literature as the figure of Christopher Columbus. We all know the story about how Christopher Columbus actually wanted to come to India, but he ended up discovering America. Now, the discovery of America is really rather important, because this is also something which ties into our understanding of what we understand as colonialism, because this was very much a colonizing enterprise. This was Europe trying to conquer the New World, as they called it. And what we really have to understand is that when Columbus was going on sail and when he was actually discovering the American continent, this was being called virgin country. So when you're calling it virgin country, it is almost as though this is new land, that this is outside and beyond history, and he was following a prototype that was devised long before him and survived long after him. So therefore, the fundamental to this European encounter with the New World was, of course, the myth of Eden, as you very well know, is a very Christian myth. So therefore, it was almost as though they were discovering heaven. So therefore, right at the very inception of the way in which America comes to be shaped, there is a very strong Christian, very strong religious input into the way in which that sort of shaping happens. If we take the example of William Crashaw, for example. Now, William Crashaw and others went on to compare Virginia to the Promised Land and the immigrants to the Israelites. So here you have the invocation of the Old Testament. So look at the way in which a project that is clearly political, a project that is also clearly economic, is constantly being talked about as though it is some kind of a spiritual project, as though it is some kind of a religious project. So right at the beginning of the way in which we start to think about America, there is a very interesting way in which the political, the economic, is being hidden, as it were, by a greater sort of discourse about religion, as though this is something that God had something to do with. So therefore, God is being evoked, religion is being evoked, spirituality is being evoked to basically mask a project that is political and that is economic. If we look at the narrative, The Journey of Coronado, which was published in 1904, but it is actually from 1540 to 1542. It reveals an encounter with the vastness of America and the immense emptiness of the plains. And I think this is something that we really need to take a little bit of time to understand, because every time we think about American literature, we have to be aware of the fact that the land and the sheer scale of the land plays a very important role. We are coming, most people who are coming to America, they're coming from Europe. Europe is clearly by that time regarded as the old world, houses on top of each other, not much space available. And here they come to this enormous expanse of land. And no wonder that many of them start to think that they've actually gone to heaven, they've come to heaven. And what we really need to understand is that into that making, from its earliest stages, went not only the Spanish and the Portuguese, the French and the Native Americans, but also the English and their immediate neighbors in Scotland, Wales and Ireland. So from the beginning, the story of America is a story neither of a monolith nor a melting pot, but a mosaic, a multicultural environment in which individuals negotiate an identity for themselves between the different traditions they encounter. So the tale of American literature has been one of pluralism. It is one of collision, conflict, even congruence between different languages and literatures. And I think we really need to keep in mind that right at the very inception of American literature, I don't think there was ever any uniformity in the way in which the literature shaped, because in the course of this lecture we will find how there were different opinions, there were people opposing other opinions, so there was no uniformity. There was always at the very beginning there were differences of opinion. And let me give you the example, for example, of Plymouth Plantation. This is by William Bradford. He claimed that he would present the simple truth in all things. Now, of Plymouth Plantation, there is almost a search for meaning. It has a narrator looking for what might lie behind the mask of a material event. And this is very interesting because this habit of interpreting events with the help of a providential vocabulary was to have a profound impact on American writing, just as, for that matter, moralizing tendency and the preference for the fact rather than fiction. So there was almost as though God's will was being read into the whole project of what basically we now have learned to call colonization. Now, there were already many challenges that were being put forward to these Puritan narratives. And if we take the example of Thomas Morton, he was already being very satirical about the way in which Puritans were beginning to talk about the promised land, as though New England is this promised land. And he was talking about the happy life of savages and the natural wisdom. And Morton also describes the general inhumanity of the Puritans. So for every Puritan narrative that was about how wonderful it was and how beautiful it was to discover this new land, there were also people who were saying that yes, but this wonderful discovery of new land also brought with it a lot of acts of cruelty. There were the Native Americans who were already being oppressed. They were being killed, they were being decimated. So right at the inception of what we now term as the civilization of America, which of course many people quite rightly would disagree with, we find a huge amount of brutality, a huge amount of oppression, which is something that we really need to take note of. And of course, the bloody tenant of persecution by Roger Williams is a rather important text, because he was requesting for Christianity to be free of secular interests, because he was very well aware that this was not merely a religious project, this was also an economic and a political project as well. So we look at the narrative of Cotton Mather. I think Cotton Mather's Magnalia Christi Americana is a very important text, because this can also be regarded as a kind of an American epic. And when I'm talking about epic, as you very well know, that epics are written when a culture or when a community is trying to consolidate their identity. So therefore, here is a very clear example of the way in which the Puritans who have landed on the shores of the new land, they're trying to consolidate their identity. They're trying to look at this project in epic scale, as though this is a grand undertaking. And there are many elements in Magnalia Christi Americana where you actually see that he's hoping to link the story of his people to earlier epic migrations. And he's also suggesting a direct analogy with the journey of God's chosen people to the promised land. So his subject is a matter of both history and belief. So as we can see, that religion keeps getting invoked, and it is almost as though the will of God constantly gets invoked, as a kind of narrative is shaped as to why these people have left their home and they have settled in this new world. Now, there were others, of course, who were writing. And one other person that I would want to mention in this context is Samuel Sewall. Now, Samuel Sewall was living at a time when Puritanism no longer exerted the power it once did. And also, we see something rather remarkable in Sewall. He was looking at Puritanism from a very personal side, from a very private side. And he was trying to understand how is it that he can make sense of his life in the new world without compromising his Puritan beliefs. So, but there was to remain ingrained in American writing long after Puritan hegemony had vanished this particular notion that maybe I'm here because God wants it. Let us look at his work, The Selling of Joseph, a Memorial. Now, in this, he clearly attacked slavery. He clearly attacked slavery because he said that all men, as they are the sons of Adam, are co-heirs and have equal right unto liberty. So, can you imagine that even in 1700, there were already people who were making quite strident protests against the inhuman practice of slavery. And this continues to happen. We have growing secularism, which of course you are going to read about more in the text that you have. And this is something which I would want to focus on by primarily citing, say for example, the travel journals of Sarah Kimball Knight and William Byrd of Westover. Now, Sarah Kimball Knight's work is rather interesting because this is not the kind of work that men were producing. Men were producing very serious work, but Sarah Kimball Knight's work, it was very lively, it was very humorous, there was a lot of gossip, there was a lot of comedy, and she was also talking about the extraordinary beauty of the American landscape. So she, for example, talks about the way in which she's so deeply overwhelmed by the sight of the woods lit up by the moon, and of course the invocation of the American landscape is something that constantly comes up. It almost becomes a part of the American identity. It's as though nothing is more American than vast empty spaces. And this is something that we see from the earliest examples of American writing. Take, for example, the correspondence of the three William Byrds. And here also he is talking about America in which he lived like the patriarchs. Now, secularism is not to be found only in the prose. It was very much there in fiction, as in poetry as well. So you've got Nathaniel Evans's poems that were not, they were very, very clearly secular. And we also have later poems by Sarah Wentworth Morton. We also have Lucy Terry. I think Sarah Wentworth Morton deserves a little bit of time because she became quite well known for a very strong anti-slavery poem called The African Chief, which was written in 1823. And Lucy Terry, she was an African slave who wrote this rather powerful poem called Bar's Fight. And this is where we come to another very important aspect which is going to be developed even further in the 19th century, which is how does poetry help to create the sense of the American nation. This is a rather important part because later on we are going to study other poets. We are going to study Walt Whitman, for example, who contributed greatly to the consolidation of American nation through his poems, most importantly his book, The Leaves of Grass. So over here, I think there turns out to be some kind of a schism. There turns out to be some kind of a division in the sense that there will be some people who are going to say the poetry is not needed, we don't need poetry anymore, and then there will be other people who are going to say no, poetry is essential. Now, this is something that we are not entirely unfamiliar with, because if you remember the Greek philosopher Plato, in Plato's Republic, Plato says clearly in his Republic that poets are not necessary. He says that poets are not required, they should be banished from the ideal republic because poets are, they are imaginative people, they have a very, very weak grasp of reality, so poets are not required. So every time a nation or a people or a communal identity begins to take shape, there is this inevitable debate as to exactly what position the arts are going to occupy in that culture. So there will always be people who are going to say the arts are not necessary because arts are decorative, arts are for entertainment, arts are superfluous, arts are supplementary, but then there are going to be these other people who are going to say, no, arts are very important for the consolidation of one's identity. And this is something that we find also at the inception of American literature as we know it. So we come to the way in which there was also a tension regarding what kind of writings were being written. So there continued to be religious writing, but there continued to be secular writing as well. Let me talk about Jonathan Edwards, for example. Now, Jonathan Edwards felt compelled not only to sit and view the moon, the clouds, and the sky, to behold the sweet glory of God in these things, but also to review and discipline the conduct of his life. So he composed 70 resolutions with the aim of improving himself in the light of his faith. Edwards wanted to harness reason in the service of faith, and if necessary to defend mystery with logic, which is nowhere better illustrated than in his book, The Great Christian Doctrine of Original Sin Defended, and 2 dissertations. So here was somebody who was trying to work out his life in alignment with the Christian teachings that he has received, but he's also trying to reconcile it with the new conditions in which he finds himself. We come now to perhaps one of the most important figures of 18th century. We come to the figure of Benjamin Franklin. Now, the thing about Benjamin Franklin that you have to understand is that he is somebody who contributed very, very greatly to the idea of the self-made man. And to a very large extent also, this notion of the self-made man becomes a very important part of the American dream. So now, when we talk about the American dream, the first idea that comes into people's heads is, I can be whatever I want to be. So that basically means that there is no limit to how much I can improve, there is no limit to how much I can change my life for the better, and it does not depend who I am, it depends on what I do. So this notion that a man can be whatever they want to be, this was very, very important to Benjamin Franklin, and this is something which has also become very much a part of our understanding of the American dream, because now we are looking at a situation where people are going to the US because they know that America offers them possibilities of improvement, of changing their lives for the better that perhaps other countries don't offer. And this is something which has come to be known as the American dream. Of course, subsequently, there will be many, many instances where this American dream is going to be challenged. Many people are going to say that this American dream actually doesn't exist. Many people are going to say that America is also as hierarchical as any other country. But the idea of the American dream continues to be very, very powerful. And he also, of course, was very necessary. We have to talk about him in the context of the American Revolution, because he definitely protested against the massacre of Native Americans in his A Narrative of the Late Massacres, which was published in 1764, and he also protested against the way in which women were being accused of witchcraft. For example, a witch trial at Mount Holly, which was published in 1730, and he also satirized the slave trade in On the Slave Trade, which was published in 1790. He also protested against British imperialism in an edict by the King of Prussia in 1773. He was also a member of the committee which went on to draft the Declaration of Independence. He was also one of the 3 American signatories to the treaty that ended the Revolutionary War. And he became a member of the convention which drafted the Constitution of the United States. So you cannot possibly talk about the way in which America as a nation developed without talking at great length about Benjamin Franklin. But of course, there were others. And I think one of the most important people in this context would be Crève Coeur. Now, Crève Coeur 1735 to 1813, he says that the American is a new man who creates upon new principles. So look at the way in which there is almost a move away from the kind of hierarchy, the kind of hereditary aristocracy that people believed Europe was creaking under, and we are looking at a new society where people were not valued because of who they were related to. They were not valued because of which position in which class of society they belonged to, but they were valued because of what they did. So here we have Krevker, who talks about individuals of all nations that are melted into a new race of men. But however, James is reminded of the obscenity and injustice of slavery, which disturbs his belief in the American norm of just laws and useful toil being rewarded. So, as we shall see in another module as a part of this course on American literature, that slavery becomes very, very troublesome for those who are trying to imagine the American nation as a democratic space, because they clearly know that it is not really democratic. They know that when they are talking about a democracy, this is essentially a democracy that is only available to white men. This is not available to white women. This is certainly not available to slaves. So democracy in that sense, when we talk about America as being the oldest democracy, that may not be strictly accurate, because the way in which democracy takes shape in America, it takes shape on the basis of several exclusions. So we can't really call it democratic in the sense that democracies are supposed to be all inclusive. We come to Thomas Paine, who is very important for us not only in the context of American literature, but also in the context of feminism, but that is something that we shall discuss perhaps elsewhere. Tom Paine is of great interest to us because he was responsible, among a few others as well, for bringing in a typically Enlightenment spirit. Now, what is the Enlightenment spirit? The Enlightenment spirit is all about simple facts, plain arguments, and common sense. So there was a very strong emphasis on a kind of belief which was predicated on a sense of examining facts as they are, on simple arguments, and on common sense. And these also become very important parts of the American mindset as well. The Rights of Man is a work by Tom Paine that needs to be talked about, because in this he's talking against hereditary monarchy. He was charged with sedition and he was forced to flee to France, and again for this protest against the execution of Louis XVI, he was imprisoned in France, and the Age of Reason, in which he attacked religion for its irrationality. And all of this comes into play when we are thinking about the American literature of the 18th century. Thomas Jefferson becomes a very important figure as well, because he is somebody who also said, he spoke of a right which nature has given to all men of departing from the country in which chance, not choice, has placed them. So he was also in a sense talking about the way in which you can make of your life as you wish to. There is no limit to how much you can change your life. You can go wherever you want, and you can be whatever you want to be. In 1776, he became a member of the committee which would draft the Declaration of Independence, and we also know that, like Krevker, Jefferson also felt compelled to confront the challenge to his idyllic vision of America posed by the indelible fact of slavery. So therefore, there was a constant tension between the way in which they were trying to think about America as a nation of equality, but at the same time they were faced with blatant inequality at the level of how much slavery was being practiced. Not only were there people who were talking against slavery, but there were also voices that were being raised against the way in which women were being treated. And I think Abigail Adams, wife of John Adams, she becomes a fairly important person in this regard, because all men are created equal, it says in the Declaration of Independence. Now that explicitly excludes women, and of course implicitly it excludes Native Americans, and it also excludes African Americans. So therefore all men, the men over there really are white men. So among the leading voices, there was certainly Tom Paine, who was talking about the way in which the rights of women need to be protected and they need to be honored. Judith Sargent Murray, and in particular on the equality of the sexes, published in 1790, she could very well be regarded as one of the first American feminists. And if we look at her work, we are going to see that she is talking about a kind of equality. She's talking about a kind of equality, and she is also talking about the way in which women are not sufficiently educated. So she is drawing attention to the way in which women suffer simply because right at the beginning of their development they are denied the quality and the quantity of education that is usually made available to men. There were others, Hendrik Opotmuth, there was also Samson Occam, Lemuel Haynes, there were also people like Jupiter Hammond, Phyllis Wheatley. There were many people who were also contributing to a very large extent to the Native American writing. These were the people or their tribes that were decimated, they were cruelly and brutally suppressed when the white settlers came over, and they began writing very much also in the 18th century. Now here I think I would also want to talk about somebody who you will also hear about in your module on slave narratives, that is Olaudah Equiano. Now Olaudah Equiano, the autobiography is now established as a form of slave narrative, and in this there is a very interesting reworking that's happening, because he is looking at Africa as the Eden, which is remarkably different from the way in which many people were regarding America as the new Eden. And he is there is almost like a reversal of the gaze, because he is frightened of white men, he is frightened of being eaten by white people, and he conceived of the white masters as savages, which is rather interesting, because normally when white people use the word savages, they are actually talking about black people. So you find this rather amazing way in which there is a certain reversal of gaze that is happening. Something else that I think needs to be pointed out over here is that in Olaudah Equiano's narrative there is also a rather wonderful element, because there is a friendship with a white young lad. Now this close friendship is rather interesting, because it has got later ramifications when we come to the poetry of Walt Whitman, because this anticipates a powerful theme in later American writing of interracial and often homoerotic intimacy. A lot of poems were being written, and in your modules you are going to see names of various poets. Jupiter Hammond, for example, you are going to come across, Phyllis Wheatley. You are also going to look at white poets such as Philip Freneau, Timothy Dwight, and so there will be lots and lots of people who are also writing at this time. We also see some plays being written, and here of course it becomes a little difficult, because the best known play of this time, The Contrast, written by Royal Tyler, this was partially inspired after he watched a performance of Sheridan's The School for Scandal, and subtly influenced by English 18th century comedies. This is, again, the theme is typically American, since the contrast of the title is between European affectation and American straightforwardness. We have some novels being written. Most importantly, you've got The Power of Sympathy by William Hill Brown, you've got Charlotte Temple by Susanna Haswell Rawson, and The Coquette by Hannah Webster Foster. Also something that begins to happen around this time is the rise of the professional writer. The first person who earned the title of a professional writer is Charles Brogden Brown. Now he was also the first person who discovered the uses of the unreliable narrator, and of course the unreliable narrator becomes a very important element in later fiction, especially in the fiction that comes in the 19th century. And with that, we come to the end of this discussion of American literature in between 1700 and 1800. What I would wish you to remember is that when we begin to look at American literature, we are also looking at the way in which there are several elements that are already there in the 18th century that are later on developed, not only in the 19th but also in the 20th, and certainly continue to be operative in the 21st century. So as we have been seeing, there were several elements that were at work in the 18th century when American literature was taking shape. As we saw, there were voices that were protesting against slavery. As we saw, there were voices that were already protesting against patriarchy. We also saw that there were various kinds of writing. So not only did you have fictional writing, but you also had non-fictional writing. And I think what we really need to be aware of is particularly the use of the term man or men. Because if you look very carefully, everywhere the term man or men is being used, it is being used in the sense of including everyone. But of course, as we know, it does not quite include everyone. So of course, we are going to look at literature from the 18th century as was being written in America, but while looking at literature from the 18th century, we would also be aware of the fact that these literatures were also either trying to hide exclusions, social exclusions, socio-cultural exclusions, or they were protesting against such exclusions. So every single author was in some way defined by the way in which they were shaped by society. Thank you.